Hello, everyone. Welcome to EROSS 2020. They are online summer seminars. And this is the very last EROSS this year. So this is our 20th talk. So we spent the whole summer closed at home talking about concepts in different terms. As you know by now, EROSS is a series of talks with world-class researchers in areas which are important to conceptual modeling, to cognitive science, philosophy, linguistics, artificial intelligence, and so on. Tomorrow, so EROSS is connected to the International Conference on Conceptual Modeling, to the 4 decades tradition of this conference. And tomorrow the conference starts. So please check the ER website. And this is the very last EROSS in the eve before ER starts. I'm Giancarlo Guizzardi, and I've been organizing this together with Enrico Franconi, Claudine Moraes, and Tiago Salles. What makes humans superior learners is our ability to generalize from a few examples guided by mental models built on implied intentions. But that's also what makes us inferior unlearners. Our obsession with intention may be a powerful shortcut for learning, but it also may limit our ability to change our minds once they are made up. So this is a quote from the most recent book of our guest of today, and we're extremely happy to have here in our series of seminars Professor César Hidalgo. He's internationally known for his contributions to economic complexity, data visualization, and applied artificial intelligence. He currently holds a chair at the Artificial and Natural Intelligence Institute at the University of Toulouse in France. He's also an honorary professor at the University of Manchester and a visiting professor at Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Science. Between 2010 and 2019, he led the Collective Learning Group at MIT. And prior to working at MIT, he was a research fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He's also the founder of Datawheel, an award-winning company specialized in the creation of data distribution and visualization systems. He's spoken in a multitude of events, including several keynote speeches, and a very, very interesting TED Talk entitled "A Bold Idea to Replace Politicians." Over the years, he has received a number of awards, including the 2018 Lagrange Prize and 3 Webbies. And finally, he's the author of 3 books: The Atlas of Economic Complexity by MIT Press from 2014, and his most recent book, How Humans Judge Machines. So these are really nice books. I read the 3 of them, and it was really a pleasure to read the books. They are extremely well written and profound and very stimulating. So I'm very glad to welcome him here today. César Hidalgo, welcome to EROSS.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you for the quote, because today in my presentation, I'm going to talk about how humans judge machines. But since there is a limited amount of time, I'm going to focus on the experimental evidence that we have collected on how humans judge machines, rather than on the more philosophical implications that we do explore in the book. And the way to motivate the book is quite simple. We all know that AI is somehow changing our world. It is changing the way that we collect, mineral resources. It is changing the way in which we think about farming. It is changing the way in which we run and store and organize, different items in a supply chain. It is also changing the service industry, and it's even changing the way that we do warfare. But AI is not only changing the world through machines that are mechanically embodied. There's a lot of machines that actually take the form of software and also interact with us in other settings. For instance, AI also is changing the way that we run human resources. Now there are algorithms that are involved in human resource screening or sometimes even in decisions. Also, AI is changing the way that we think about the legal system and the judicial system. The judicial system is a system that has, many more cases than the ones that usually judges and their clerks can process, and people have turned into AI tools, to help speed up, the functioning of the system. And the question that I'm going to ask today is, well, how do people judge this technology? Technology is helping perform actions that sometimes, people also would perform, but, whether we see technology as positive or negative also depends on us, on the way that we perceive that technology. And what I'm going to try to do is to try to see how people perceive AI compared to how they perceive humans that are doing exactly the same thing. And the reason why I'm interested in this question is because, machines can make mistakes and encode biases. We've seen many examples of machines making mistakes and encoded biases, particularly when it comes to, computer vision or, generation of images through GANs. But we also know that humans can make mistakes and encode biases too. So humans are not infallible either. And the question that I'm going to ask is, if we have a machine and we have a human that make the same mistake, do we get the same reaction? Or do people judge humans and machines differently, even though they see them doing the same thing? So this is something that I work on to produce this book, which has original research and has several chapters that are dedicated to different topics. For example, chapter 2 focus on the ethics of AI. Chapter 3 focuses on algorithmic bias, in different situations. Chapter 4 on privacy. Chapter 5 on labor displacement. And today I'm not going to look at the entire book, but I'm going to look at a few selected examples to try to see how it is that people judge machines in these examples and how we can generalize, some of these behaviors that will serve throughout these different type of examples. So I'm going to just be showing a few things from what is a larger book, but the book is available, open access, for free at judgingmachines.com. So if you're interested in getting a copy of the book, you can download the PDF, directly from judgingmachines.com, both, for desktop and for mobile. So what is the book about? The book is based on randomized experiments. In these randomized experiments, we assign people randomly to two groups of around 200 people each. And each group is going to see the same exact scenario, except that one group is going to see it as the action of a machine, and the other group is going to see it as the action of a human. And these differences in reactions are going to tell us whether people judge humans or machines, the same or differently. And this is a good setup. Why? Because by having people see scenarios as the action of a machine and having a different group of people see the same scenarios as the action of a human, we avoid cross-contamination of people seeing scenarios that are similar, sometimes phrased as the actions of a machine and sometimes phrased as the actions of a human. So the people that participate in these experiments did not know that we were comparing human and machines. The people that participated in these experiments thought that they were evaluating a set of scenarios that involve human actions, and a different group of people thought that they were evaluating a set of scenarios involving machine actions. So how do these experiments work? So consider the following scenario. An excavator is digging up a site for a new building. Unbeknownst to the driver, the site contains a grave. The driver does not notice the grave and digs through it. Later, human remains are found. So this is a scenario that could be the action of a machine, like an autonomous excavator, or a human that is operating that excavator. It's plausible, something that could be, the result of the action of a human or a machine. And what we're going to try to understand is if people judge, this differently depending on who performed the action. Now, before we do that, we're going to classify scenarios according to the 5 moral dimensions, from the moral foundation theory. And then, we're also going to look at people's reactions according to a number of different evaluative questions. So the 5 dimensions of the moral foundation theory are the different ways in which we judge moral situations. So for instance, we can judge a moral situation because it involves harm or care. When someone hits someone, we make a moral judgment, and that triggers the moral dimension of harm. But there are also situations that sometimes are unfair. For instance, when we're looking at human resources or hiring or salary or promotions, those are situations that do not involve harm per se, but they involve fairness, whether things are done in a way that people would consider fair or not. There's also moral dilemmas that involve loyalty, for instance, treason to a national flag, other ones that involve authority. And finally, there are moral dilemmas that involve purity or sanctity, which could be things as religious symbols for some people, or the human body or a pet, which also sometimes have a component of sanctity. So in the case of the excavator digging up a grave, we're going to find that this is a scenario that actually is about the moral dimension of purity. How do we do that? We run a separate data collection exercise in which people have to associate this scenario to words. And these 20 words come from this list in which we have words associated to these different moral dimensions. So in the case of the excavator scenario, people associate this scenario to words that are associated to the purity dimension. And the reason is that, of course, when you dig up a grave, you didn't hurt anyone. It's not unfair. It's not a breach of loyalty or authority, but there's something sacred about the human body, and that means that, this is a scenario that violates that moral dimension of purity. If, this scenario involved digging up some chicken bones, nobody would have thought that there's something immoral here. But digging up a human grave, is something that is considered indecent or obscene because people associate something sacred to the human body. And therefore, this scenario is associated to the moral dimension of purity. Now, the last thing that I'm going to do before we look at how scenarios are judged is to talk a little bit about the role of intention. So imagine the following two scenarios. In the first scenario, Alice and Bob are two colleagues working in a software company and competing for a promotion. Alice has a severe peanut allergy, and knowing this, Bob sneaks into the office kitchen and mixes a large spoonful of peanut butter into Alice's soup. At lunchtime, Alice accidentally drops her soup on the floor, after which she decides to go out for lunch. She suffers no harm. So in this first scenario, Bob tries to poison Alice, but because of an accident, she suffers no harm. So there's high intention, but no harm. In the second scenario, Alice and Bob are also two colleagues at work. The conditions are just the same. Alice has a severe peanut allergy, but in this case, Bob does not know about it. So, Alice asks Bob to get lunch for them. He brings her a peanut butter sandwich. She grabs the sandwich, takes a bite, and she ends up in the hospital. So in this case, there is harm, but there is no intention. How do people react, to these different scenarios? How would people judge them? Would you judge that Bob did something wrong in a scenario A or a scenario B? And for most cases, it would be on a scenario B, because in that second scenario, it would be on a scenario A, because on that first scenario, Bob, tries to hurt Alice, even he doesn't succeed. In that scenario B, he actually hurts Alice, but it's an accident. So intention has a huge role in the way that we think about morality. Now, can we think about intention on machines? Naively, we think like, well, machines are just dumb and stupid. They have no intentions. But when we're talking about artificial intelligence, we're not talking about dumb machines. We're talking about machines with the ability to learn. So imagine that you have a self-driving car that is designed to protect a driver at all costs, or a self-driving car that is designed to protect a pedestrian at all costs. In the first case, the self-driving car might encounter a situation in which it needs to make a sudden move, and to make that sudden move, he, because is trying to protect the driver at all costs, might injure a pedestrian. If the self-driving car is designed to protect a pedestrian at all costs, it might make a maneuver in which he injures the driver to protect that pedestrian. So even though the car is not an agent like a human, if it has a certain goal that was given to it, or that it has learned, and is trying to choose an action to achieve that goal, is going to find, some level of agency in how it achieves that goal. Okay, so it can achieve the goal in different ways, and by learning or figuring out how to achieve that goal, it's going to execute some type of agency because it's going to be working as it is intended to, not because it has intention. So there is some agency when machines have the ability to learn. This is not a dumb machine that is doing repetitive motion. It's a machine that is trying to figure out how to satisfy a goal, and that gives them some agency. If the machine can also learn what goals to satisfy, it would have even more agency. So we can think that intention is not something that you either have or not, but it's a continuum, and machines with the ability to learn, are already part of that continuum. Now, if we go back to the Bob and Alice example, here we will find that, in the case that there was intention but no harm, people would associate a higher level of wrongness than when there was harm and no intention. So this allows us to formalize this idea, in which we're looking at machines, we're seeing if they make a mistake, we're looking at humans, we're seeing if they make the same mistake, and we're going to see if people reacted differently. We can now associate that to a function, how wrong something is, that W there, as a function of intention, harm, the different moral dimensions. the characteristics of the agent, the characteristics of the subject or the victim, and then the question that we're going to ask is, are these functions the same when we're trying to judge a human or when we're trying to judge a machine? Do we use the same function or we use different mathematical functions? Now, let's go back to our excavator scenario. And what we did here is to ask this group of about 200 people each whether the action was harmful, whether they would hire the driver for a similar position, whether the action was intentional, whether they liked the driver, whether it was morally right or wrong for the driver to perform that action, whether they agree that the driver should be promoted or given more responsibility, whether the driver should be replaced with a robot or an algorithm, so replaced by something different. When we ask this question in the context of the machine, we ask if the machine should be replaced by a human. Should they be replaced by the same? Should the driver should be replaced by another person, or should the machine replaced by another machine? Do you think that the driver is responsible for the action? And if you were in a similar situation, would you have done the same? And we look at how people react, to these scenarios in these questions, and we then can compare, the average answer of the different groups, and we have, of course, a confidence interval. So, for instance, here, when we look at the moral dimension of harm, we see that people attribute more harm to this action, which is the action of a machine, than that of a human, and that is statistically significant. When we ask people, would you hire, the human again? People would hire the human again, despite the fact that the human unearthed the grave, but they're less likely to want to hire the machine again. When they look at intentions, we don't find a big significant difference, in this case, and they like the human more, they find it more morally correct, they're more likely to want to promote him, and so forth. So now let's look now at some more interesting examples, now that we understand the methodology. So the first example is a triplet, which involves decision-making in an emergency situation. A large tsunami is approaching a coastal town of 10,000 people with potentially devastating consequences. The politician or algorithm responsible for the safety of the town can decide to evacuate everyone with a 50% chance of success, or save 50% of the town with a 100% chance of success. So you have a scenario, in which there's three possible outcomes. The first one is that the politician or algorithm decides to save everyone, but the rescue effort fails. The town is devastated and a large number of people die. So here you take the risk and you fail. The second possible outcome is that the politician or algorithm decides to save everyone and the rescue effort succeeds. Everyone is saved. The third possible outcome is that the politician or algorithm decides to save 50% of the town, like half of the town, so they take a compromise, and here you know what's going to happen. This scenario involves the moral dimensions of harm and fairness, because people suffer, but also it's unfair to choose who are you going to save or not in the case that you take a compromise. And on average, of course, 50% of people are saved because the probability of succeeding in the case that you take the risk is 50%, but the outcomes end up being different. So we're basically giving the full outcome to the person and not asking what they would do in that case, but to judge the action that was performed. Now, what do we find? In the case that we take a compromise, we don't see a lot of big differences, except on the situation in which we ask people, would you replace the machine by a human or the human by a machine? And people want to replace the machine by a human. But that's usually the case. So we're not going to read that much into that because we are going to see a lot of variation in that question. But for the most part, we don't see big differences when we take the compromise. Now, when we try to save everyone and succeed, this is like the lucky scenario. People give much more credit to the human than to the machine. The human is the blue, remember. Okay? People are more likely to want to hire the human. They see the action of the human as more intentional. They like the human more. They find that the action was more morally correct, even though the action was exactly the same. They also, see themselves more likely to have done the same in a similar situation, but just a little bit. But let's look at when you try to save everyone and fail. And here, when you take the risk and you fail, the machine is judged much worse. They see the machine as doing much more harm, okay? They don't want to hire the machine. They would hire the human again. They see the machine, a little bit less intentional, but not a big difference. They also see, they like the human much more. They see the human as doing something much more morally correct than the machine that did the same, and they see, of course, people see themselves more likely to have done the same in a similar situation. So here we have the same setup, different outcomes, and here we find strong differences on the way that people judge machines and humans. Well, why might that be the case? Well, because in this case in which you try to save everyone and fail, the machine is being judged by trying to save everyone. Sorry, the human is being judged by trying to save everyone, and the machine is being judged by failing. The human is being judged by the intention, what they're trying to do, and the machine is being judged by the outcome, what they achieve. And that's something that we're going to see help to explain a large number of scenarios. But before we get there, let's look at a few more of them. Now we're going to look at a self-driving car scenario. On a sunny spring day, a driver or driverless car working for a supermarket chain accidentally runs over a pedestrian who runs in front of the vehicle. The pedestrian is hurt and taken to the hospital. Then we do the same scenario with a dog, which is a victim that has, lower moral status, than the human. These are scenarios that involve the moral dimension of harm, but also that accidental. The car working for a supermarket chain accidentally runs over a pedestrian who runs in front of the vehicle. So it's not the car's fault, it's the pedestrian's fault, or it's the dog's fault in this case. We do a similar example, with a car in a cold, windy day, working for a supermarket chain that swerves to avoid a falling tree. By swerving, the driver or driverless car loses control of the vehicle, leading to an accident that seriously injures a pedestrian on the sidewalk. Okay, so here a self-driving car or a driver tries to avoid this falling tree and injures a pedestrian on the sidewalk. In that case, they injures a dog, but the idea is the same. What do we find? Well, for the most part, the 4 scenarios, behave the same. So that's good. It means that, like our data collection exercise is going to have the same results for similar variations. But we do find differences, again, in the way that people judge machines and they judge humans. So they see the action of machines as more harmful, in all of these scenarios. They see also, they like the human driver more, and of course, they're more likely to want to replace the self-driving car by a human. They don't give the self-driving car a second chance, but they don't want to replace the human driver by a machine, What is interesting about this scenario, though, here is the intentional dimension. If you see the intentional dimension here, people put more intention on the machine than on the human. So in this scenario that is accidental, people are willing to completely excuse or forgive the human, but they're not so willing to excuse or completely forgive the machine. And that is interesting because, of course, the naive intuition is that people always see the actions of humans as more intentional as those of machines. But here we find a counterexample. When we have a situation that is very accidental, people put no intention on the human and put a little bit of intention on the machine. So far, we've seen examples in when machines don't do well. In the excavator scenario, in the self-driving car scenario, or in the tsunami scenario, people are judging machines more strongly than they're judging humans. So is this always the same? Is this just like all that there is to it? Is this just another example of algorithmic aversion? Do people always reject machines, or can we find examples in which machines, are judged less harshly than humans? So let me show you 2 examples. The first one involves plagiarism. So a record label hires a songwriter or an AI songwriter to write lyrics for famous musicians. The songwriter or AI songwriter has written lyrics for dozens of songs in the past year. But a journalist later discovers that the songwriter or this songwriting algorithm has been plagiarizing lyrics from lesser-known artists. Many artists are outraged when they learn about the news. So this is an example involving the moral dimension of fairness. Okay. Now, we have another example here, borrowed from the Moral Foundation questionnaire from Jonathan Hyde, which says a family has a cleaner robot in charge of cleaning their house. One day, the family finds that the cleaner robot used an old national flag to clean the bathroom floor and then threw it away. So this is a scenario that touches on the moral dimensions of purity and loyalty because it desecrates a national symbol. How do people react to these scenarios? Well, in the plagiarism scenario, people see the action of the human plagiarist as more harmful than that of the machine, And when we ask people if you find the action to be more morally wrong or right, they find the action of the machine a little bit more morally right than the action of the human in both cases. So in these cases, even though, of course, they always want to replace the machine by a human, they find the action of the human as less morally correct, than that of the machine. Now, let's look at more examples of algorithmic bias. And here we're going to look at examples that involve human resource screenings, policing, university admissions, and so forth. A company replaces their HR manager with a new manager or algorithm tasked with screening candidates for job interviews. There is an unfair treatment and a fair treatment. In the unfair treatment, an audit revealed that the new manager or algorithm never selects Hispanic, African American, or Asian candidates, even when they have the same qualification as other candidates. In the fair treatment, an audit reveals that the new manager or algorithm produces a fair process for Hispanic, African American, and Asian candidates. So we have an HR algorithm or manager, and in one case, an audit reveals that they're being unfair to certain populations, and in that case, they reveal that it's correcting some unfairness that was there, before this algorithm or manager arrived. What do we find? Well, we have college admissions, policing, salary increases, all they give us similar results. So we're going to look at just, one of them. So in the unfair treatment, when the algorithm or the human discriminates, people don't like either, of course. They find the action to be very harmful and they find it to be very immoral, but they find the action of the human doing that more immoral than the action of the machine doing that. And they find the action of the human also in some cases as a slightly more harmful. So this is another example in which people judge humans more harshly, albeit a little bit, than machines, and it's also a moral dilemma involving the dimension of fairness. When the treatment is fair, we don't see a lot of differences. For the most part, people judge the machine and the human the same, but they see the action of the human, as much more intentional, and they do find the human, for instance, to be much more responsible for the action and the outcome. So they see kind of like the human doing that intentionally. They see the machine more or less, in the middle of the scale. Not by accident, but not intentional either. Now we're going to look at labor displacement. Labor displacement has a big topic, So here we wanted to see how people reacted to labor displacement when it was attributed to a machine or to humans. And here we use some particular types of humans, for example, foreigners in some cases, as a way to have a comparison between labor displacement attributed to humans and machines. A trucking company is looking to lower costs by bringing in temporary foreign drivers or autonomous trucks. This change reduces the company's cost by 30%, but several local drivers lose their jobs. A nuclear power plant is looking to lower their operational costs. They decide to bring in foreign nuclear technicians or buy an AI operating system. This change allows the company to reduce their operational cost by 30%, but several local technicians lose their jobs. A large chain of luxury resorts, they can bring foreign workers or vending and cooking robots. A school is looking to lower their costs. They can bring robot teachers or they can bring foreign teachers. So this all involve the moral dimension of fairness, because they involve the displacement of someone for a machine or for another human. How did people react to this scenario? We asked people, would you approve of this change? Would you ban this change? Do you find it morally right or wrong? Does your opinion about this company improve or not? Do you think that others will approve? Would you have done the same on a similar situation? And if you look at the example in which, truck drivers are replaced by autonomous vehicles or by foreign drivers, people tend to approve of the technology much better than of the humans. So they approve of the change much more likely when we phrase this as a technological change. They reject it when it involves foreigners. They want to ban the change when it involves foreigners. They find it less morally correct to bring foreigners than to, bring autonomous vehicles. Their opinion about the company goes lower, like it decreases by more when it involves foreign workers and so forth. Now, when we look at the hotel, we see a similar pattern, but the differences are not as strong. When we look at the nuclear technicians, this difference almost disappears. And when we look at the school, the difference basically disappears. But here is because they don't like the human or the machine at all. So in these other three scenarios, it's interesting because we see that people make a strong difference between humans and machines when it involves kind of like these blue-collar jobs, the truck drivers, and when it involves, the hotel workers. But in the nuclear technician example, people seem to be relatively more accepting of the foreign technicians, compared to machines than in these other examples. And this could be because at higher levels of skill, people are more accepting, of human forms of displacement, but at low level of skills, people kind of like see some sort of responsibility of protecting local jobs, compared to foreign jobs. Now we do more examples involving service sector companies, a law firm that is looking to lower the cost for routine clinical work. And here they can decide to open a branch in a low-income country. So this would be, offshoring, hire a foreign contractor, outsourcing, bring in foreign workers with temporary visas, replace older workers with younger workers, and buy an AI legal system. And we do this for a law firm, a hospital, a software firm, a manufacturing company. All of them, are doing either offshoring, outsourcing, foreign workers, or younger workers compared to technology. And we find something similar than before. In general, people prefer technological displacement by a machine than displacement by foreigners, through offshoring, outsourcing, or by younger people, even though these younger people are local. And actually, they react the worst to displacement by foreign and by younger people. Offshoring is the one that is the most similar to the way that people rate technological displacement. So when you look at these different forms of human-to-human displacement, offshoring and outsourcing are relatively accepted compared to bringing foreign workers or replacing older workers by younger workers, which would be considered age discrimination. Nevertheless, none of those, across the board score better than technological displacement. So this tells us that people may be more willing to accept displacement attributed to technology than to, other individuals. Now we're going to try to put all of this together in this last chapter, which, what it's going to do is it's going to look across scenarios. So we're going to take a simplified view, and we're going to look at many scenarios together through descriptive statistics, and then by doing a little bit of modeling. So first, for the descriptive statistics, what we're going to do is we're going to build this three-dimensional space. We call this the moral space, where you have harm, intention, and wrongness. Where you here each scenario is represented by two dots. One dot shows, the evaluation that the scenario received when it was presented as the action of a machine, and the other one when it was presented as the action of a human. And these two dots are connected, so we can keep track of, which dots correspond to the same scenario. Here is how all of these dots look together. So they define a three-dimensional space, and actually they live kind of like on a plane, because of course there are some situations that are forbidden. A situation with no harm and no intention, of course, cannot be judged as very wrong. But to understand this better, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the different faces of this cube. So here we have the intention and harm plane. And what we see here is that, all of these blue dots, when people are judging humans, are either on the top or on the bottom of the respective red dots, which show how people judge machines. So this tells us that people judge the intentions of humans by modally. We either put a lot of intention or little intention on humans, but when it comes to machines, we put them kind of like in the middle. We put a little bit of intention, but we don't excuse them as much either. So that difference tells us that we're judging humans and machines quite differently when it comes to the way that we're treating intention. For humans, we're very bimodal, we're very polarized. You either meant it or it was an accident. For machines, it's more in this middle range. Now, when we look at intention and wrongness, we see that, of course, as intention grows, wrongness grows as well. It could be something that is very bad, very wrong, or something that is very good, very positive, with low wrongness. At high levels of intention, basically, intention is the one that determines whether the machine or the human is judged better or worse. If the action is negative, for the most part here, we see scenarios in which the human, is judged worse than the machine, except this case here, which is one of the self-driving car. Sorry, not one of the self-driving, but this is a scenario that involves an extrajudicial killing in which people put, more harm in the case that a machine performed it. Let me go back here. Now, when the action is positive, people see the action of the machine as less positive than that of the human. They see the action of the human as more positive and more intentional. But for low levels of intention, people see, the machine action as worse than the human action. Finally, when we look at the harm-wrongness plane, we see that there's a correlation between harm and wrongness, but also different regimes. For example, here at low levels of harm, we see that machines are judged worse than humans. And here at high levels of harm, these are the scenarios, once again, of the algorithmic bias examples. We find that people judge here humans worse than they judge machines, except here for this extrajudicial killing scenario in which they judge the machine worse than they judge the human. Next, we're going to proceed to model these model functions, and we're going to do is using simple statistics. So we're going to try to predict the wrongness of a scenario as a function of intention and harm, and we're going to do this for people judging humans and people judging machines. We're going to approximate these functions to, like the interaction term, and that's going to give us a function of wrongness as a function of harm, intention, and interaction term, and then we're going to have fixed effects, for subjects, so that we can control for differences that are constant between subjects, for instance, like one subject being too judgy compared to another subject. And what do we find here? Well, when we look at the level of wrongness that a person attributes to a scenario as a function of intention, harm, and the interaction term between harm and intention, and we look at people judging machines, what we find is that most of the action here is in the harm term, the harm term explains like the lion's share of the variance, and it has a strong coefficient, and in total, the fixed effects model explains 64% of the variance over around 15,000 observations. So the model is doing quite well to explain the variance with relatively few parameters, and it tells us that harm is really important as a predictor of wrongness when people judge machines. When people judge people, we find that harm is not that important, and the really important term is this interaction term between harm and intention. This one is really strong. We have a similar percentage of the variance explained in this fixed effects model. So the fixed effects here are for the scenarios. We're basically controlling for things that are, for each scenario, and basically what we find is, that the interaction term between harm and intention really matter. So what do we observe here? Well, we observe if we translate those statistics into mathematical functions and we plot them, what we find is that this red plane is the way in which people judge machines, and the blue plane is the way in which people judge other people. And the functions are quite different. Even though they overlap here and they intersect, the way that people judge, machines depends mostly on the harm axis, okay? But the way that people judge other people depends more on this interaction term, on this diagonal, and that gives it also certain curvature, and a big difference here at low levels of intention, in which machines are going to be judged much worse, than humans doing the same thing. So machines basically are not allowed to make mistakes in this zero intention, regime. Machines are judged much worse, but at high levels of intention, then humans are judged a little bit worse than machines. So we have an answer to our question. When machines and humans make the same mistake, they don't get the same reaction. And one way to summarize this difference is that people judge humans by their intentions and judge machines by their outcomes. So we're using different heuristics to judge humans and machines. I just want to remind you that these are very few examples from what is a much longer book. Here, the examples that I presented are the ones shown in blue, but all of the other examples and all of the other discussions in white is all that I missed from this presentation. So I really would like to encourage you to get the book. It's available online for free at judgingmachine.com. Finally, I want to thank my collaborators, Diana Organ and Filipa D'Almeida. They're both social psychologists. They help, develop and run all of these experiments. Jordi is a roboticist who helped inspire some of this work. And Natalia also, work on the production of some of these scenarios. And I also want to thank Gabriela Perez, who is a designer who did all of the graphic design for the book, and Mauricio Salfate and Maria Venegas that provided original illustrations, and they helped make the book beautiful through their artwork. The book is appearing with MIT Press on print on February of 2021, but it's available already at judgingmachines.com for free for anybody that would like to download it or use it as course material. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks.